Well, there is much to discuss. Let's get to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is analyst Brian Becker. He focuses on U.S. DPRK relations. Song Zhang is the Washington bureau chief for Shanghai Wenhui Daily. John Sitilides is a global risk analyst and consultant to the U.S. State Department. And with us from Buffalo in New York is Dennis Wilder. He served as a special assistant to the president and senior director for East Asian Affairs at the National Security Council under U.S. President George W. Bush. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Dennis, let me start with you in Buffalo. This is what President Trump said in his letter to the DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. He said, based on the tremendous anger and open hostility displayed in your recent statement, I feel it is inappropriate at this time to have this long-planned meeting. Therefore, please let this letter serve to represent that the Singapore summit, for the good of both parties, but the detriment of the world, will not take place. So, Dennis, tremendous anger, open hostility, but we do have that in negotiations. That's why people negotiate, don't they? Was that a good enough reason to break off these talks?
You know, I think what's gone wrong here is that both sides are talking in public about these issues. These kinds of negotiations need to be done, frankly, out of the public eye. If you look at Zhou Enlai negotiating with Kissinger, it was done in a quiet way. Actually, the early part of these negotiations between Pompeo and the North Koreans was done quietly. I think this is inexperience in the administration. I think President Trump will learn that you don't talk quite so openly, because what happens is then each side digs in before you're even at the negotiating table. So I credit some of this to inexperience, but also a tendency on the part of this administration to talk a little too much in public about their negotiations.
Brian, there's been lots of talk about the so-called Libya option. You heard that from our reporters as well. First from National Security Advisor John Bolton, then from Vice President Mike Pence. Let's watch.
I think we're looking at the Libya model of 2003, 2004. We're also looking at what North Korea itself has committed to previously. And most importantly, I think going back over a quarter of a century to the 1992 Joint North-South Denuclearization Agreement, where North Korea committed to give up nuclear weapons and committed to give up uranium enrichment and plutonium reprocessing.
We really hope that Kim Jong-un will seize the opportunity to dismantle his nuclear weapons program and do so by peaceable means. You know, as the president made clear, you know, this will only end like the Libyan model ended if Kim Jong-un doesn't make a deal.
So, Brian, President Trump initially rolled back those comments made by John Bolton, but then Vice President Pence brought it up again in that interview with the United States news channel Fox News. You've been to the DPRK several times. How would they have interpreted what they heard there? What message was that?
Well, either Washington is the amateur hour and there's not one voice speaking for the administration, or they can see that there are people, in particular Pence and John Bolton, who are deliberately trying to sabotage the agreement. And they've been waiting, not for talk so much, they've been waiting to see some practical steps on the part of the Trump administration. As Nathan mentioned in the beginning, there's two different approaches on the table here towards negotiations. For the North Koreans, it's step by step. What have they done? They unilaterally declared a moratorium on their nuclear weapons tests, their missile tests, unilaterally dismantled their nuclear test site, and unilaterally released 3 American detainees. Then they look to see the American side. And what do they see? Almost nothing from Donald Trump, but you have John Bolton and Mike Pence saying, well, the Libya model. And Pence was downright threatening. He was saying, like, if you don't do this, you're gonna end up just like Gaddafi, which means lynched or killed in the streets. Now, I think the DPRK, as of 10 days ago, actually stopped communicating with Trump. They stopped communicating about logistics because they were waiting to see, in response to their unilateral steps, would the Trump administration do something? Absent that, they've stopped talking. Now, I think the reason Trump made the announcement today is that he's not certain that North Korea is going forward under these circumstances with the summit. So this is a matter of Donald Trump saving face. This is the amateur hour a little bit with the Trump administration, but this is saving face. Do the DPRK want the summit? Perhaps, but they're not desperate for it. They're in a stronger position than they were 2 months ago.
Song, of course, China's been looking at this very closely. China is heavily invested in this process. President Xi Jinping met twice with Kim Jong-un, the last meeting taking place in Dalian. And it was after that meeting that President Trump suggested that President Kim changed his tone, adopted a new type of language, got more belligerent after that meeting with President Xi. What did you make of that?
I think he's not understanding President Xi's intention clearly, and I think the summit between Kim and President Xi Jinping in Dalian, where President Xi is trying to hear what is the North Korea's real position on this kind of U.S.-North Korea summit. And I think China understands the position of North Korea that is phased action for action model of denuclearization. And the second day after this summit with, I think, Kim, President Xi had a phone call with President Trump, where I think President Xi mentioned that China is in favor of phased action for action denuclearization. And I think President Trump understood in a way that he believed China supported North Korea's position. But I think China believes it's only fair for the two sides to accept this phased and action for action model. Other model, like proposed by John Bolton, doesn't work this way.
John, what's your view on this? What do you make of this latest development?
I think, first of all, there seems to be a missing cohesiveness to the U.S. strategy in dealing with North Korea. And I say that on two fronts. One is that the president has made very clear he's seeking, as we heard your colleague mention earlier, complete, irreversible, and verifiable denuclearization. But what that process looks like remains to be spelled out. It's clear, though, they're not going to accept the gradual step-by-step that was proposed by Kim and maybe supported by the Chinese government. This is a process that the Kim regime, the Kim dynasty, has perfected over the last half-century. And I think what Trump is looking to say is...
Let me just stop you there a moment, John. That sounds like a precondition. If that is a precondition that North Korea get rid of all its nuclear weapons before you start negotiating, what is there to negotiate?
No, that's going to be the objective of the talks. And for the president, he's made very clear, it's either the right deal, different than all the other deals that have been made by prior presidents, or no deal at all. And he's prepared to walk away from the table. But how you get there is, I think, the trouble here, because you're not going to have it at the beginning of the negotiations, but how do you get to this level of complete denuclearization in a manner that is satisfactory to all of the parties? And I think the U.S. has not really spelled that out clearly yet.
Dennis, in that letter, the president held out the hope that the summit could still take place. In fact, there was a very late story from Yonhap, the South Korean news agency, and we understand that KCNA, the North Korean news agency, also carried this story. It's one line, just 1, 2, 3, 7 words. North Korea expresses intent to talk with the U.S. What are the chances of resurrecting this summit?
I think this is just a bump in the road, and I think we're going to see the summit back on track, maybe not on the 12th, but sometime soon. You know, the North Korean negotiating team actually is in Beijing right now. And so that team could go to Singapore quite quickly. So I think that we've hit a bad patch in the negotiations, but we've hit those bad patches before. But I agree with your guest before that the U.S. side is pressing for something that's hard for the North Koreans to accept, which is some very radical steps right up front. But President Trump is also saying if he's willing to do that, all things are possible. That the United States, Japan, South Korea, the Chinese will all give him the economic assistance he needs to rebuild his country. So the U.S. is looking for what we call the Big Bang approach to this.
Right.
And the question is, can the trust be created for that kind of approach?
Brian, do you see a point or at any time where the DPRK is going to say, okay, yes, the point of these negotiations is going to be complete denuclearization. We're going to get to that point at some point in the future?
They might say it, but they mean something different. They are talking about denuclearization, including the United States, because the United States is a major nuclear power in the Asia-Pacific region. It was the United States in 1958 that introduced nuclear weapons into South Korea, into the Korean Peninsula. The United States is also a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which the North Koreans exited, that provides and demands an affirmative obligation on nuclear powers to begin the process of their own denuclearization. So the North Koreans don't want to simply disarm. They're looking at Libya, they're looking at Iraq. They're not going to disarm.
Iran.
Iraq and Libya. But what they actually want to do is they want to have not even a guarantee of security. Donald Trump's not going to give that. I mean, that you can't count on the United States to bargain in good faith, actually. What they do want, though, is a normalization of relations, meaning that would allow the DPRK to trade. It would allow the DPRK to have normal diplomatic relations. They're not going to give up nuclear weapons in exchange for nothing. And the something they want is just that. They want normalization of relations. It could start with a peace treaty or a preliminary to a peace treaty, but it's normalization.
What do you make of that, John?
Well, there are some very important points here for the North Korean regime to consider as well. If Trump is serious in the threats that we've heard over the last year and a half, if they don't find a way to achieve denuclearization at some point, the Trump administration is hell-bent on destroying the North Korean economy. They're going to destroy it from within. And the question is also, to what extent can the U.S. partner with China to help achieve an outcome that is also in China's interest? In other words, it doesn't destabilize northeastern China's region bordering the Yalu River and the like. So these are going to be important questions for the North Koreans to consider. What are the alternatives to some type of dialogue with the Trump administration and other parties such as Japan and South Korea that also have a stake here, but that include China in the mix? It's a very complicated process, and I think right now it's still very much at the early stage. And in accordance with what Dennis was saying before, I think very much this summit may have been canceled, but the dialogue, as we saw in President Trump's letter, is very much important to the administration, right. And they're going to continue this process, hopefully to another summit in the near future, if the parties can start to coalesce on some sense of shared objectives.
Song, how important does China's role now become? Is there perhaps a plan B that President Xi has up his sleeve?
I don't think there's any plan B. And according to our Foreign Minister Wang Yi speech yesterday here in Washington, I think China believes now is the appropriate time to continue this negotiation. And we still believe there's a way for North Korea and America to reach to right. each other and have their kind of middle way approach. I think the main suspect of America is that they couldn't wait for 10 years as it was proposed by this 2005 six-party document. They wanted to have a quick dismantling of the North Korea's nuclear capacity. I think North Korea, to some extent, is open for a quick kind of this nuclearization, but they want kind of action for action. I think there's a way to make these two sides to be together.
Right. Dennis, you were talking earlier on about, speaking with one voice from the White House, some cohesion right. from the White House. I mean, are there factions within the White House, and how deep are these divisions? One side saying, well, we're not too keen on this idea of talking to the DPRK, another side saying, well, I think we need to reopen these negotiations. Perhaps John Bolton got his way. He wasn't too keen on the talks right. initially. Right. What do you make of that?
Well, given that what I have heard is that the State Department was completely surprised by what the president did today, I think you can surmise that this was a decision made in the White House with a lot of input from John Bolton. We know what John Bolton thinks of negotiating with the North Koreans. He's a very great skeptic that anything can be done with the North Koreans. So I am a little worried that his influence in the White House may be a negative factor in this process. I hope that Pompeo remains in the lead because I think he has a more realistic view of how to negotiate with the North Koreans. I think John Bolton's approach basically is unconditional surrender by the North Koreans, which I don't think is a winning formula.
Dennis, another thing, I mean, if we look at what the DPRK has done, Brian talked about it just a moment ago. Kim Jong-un can say that he acted in good faith, couldn't he? He stopped the tests, the ballistic missile right. tests, shut down, in a very public way, he shut down one of the at least one of the nuclear test sites. He released those 3 American prisoners, and he's agreed to these talks. So is the onus now on the United States to show good faith?
Well, I think there is certain truth in that. I also reject the notion that the test site was not usable anymore. This seems to have become a consensus view which I think is just plain wrong. The North Koreans could have used that site. Now, it could have spewed radioactive material all over China, but it was still a usable test site. So this is an important and significant concession on the part of the North Koreans, and we should recognize those concessions. This is why I say Pompeo needs to be in the lead, because I think he does understand these concessions and is willing to work with the North Koreans in a more constructive way than perhaps others in the White House.
Go ahead, John.
Well, here's where we start to fill in the blanks with the adjectives complete and irreversible and, importantly, verifiable. This testing site was destroyed in front of journalists.
Right.
There were no international inspectors allowed at the site. So it's a partial concession, and in some ways it's a bad faith concession. If the North Korean regime was sincere about demonstrating they are going to be destroying these sites for international consumption, why not have the international inspectors there on site to verify that?
I'm waiting for the U.S. government to just invite journalists and destroy some of its nuclear test sites. I mean, that would be quite something, wouldn't it? I mean, the North Koreans consider themselves equals to the United States. They don't consider themselves to be some sort of rogue state that can be pushed around and forced to surrender. Or John Bolton, who was asked in 2005, what's your program for North Korea? And he got a book out from his library that said, no North Korea. The North Koreans just aren't going to accept that. If you have a unilateral declaration that we're not going to do nuclear weapons tests, we're not going to have missile technology tests, we're going to release American detainees, and we're going to invite the world media to come and watch the demolition, the blowing up of our only sole nuclear test site, and then for our guests to say, well, that's only a partial concession. Where has the concession been from the United States? The United States was the country that bombed North Korea mercilessly between 1950 and 53. 3 million Koreans died. That's a big part of the Korean psyche. And if you don't think that the Korean people remember this, you don't know anything about North Korea. They are insisting that the Americans come forward and also make gestures, real, not just gestures, steps forward.
Very quickly, John, a response.
If I might respond. The trust factor here is going to be absolutely critical on both sides, but let's not forget, the North Koreans have promised X, Y, and Z on numerous occasions with private administrations. They have violated them unilaterally, and the main problem right now is trusting the North Koreans to do what they say they're going to do.
Like we did with the Iran deal. Like we did with the Iran deal.
But the Iran deal was simply a presidential commitment that could be negated with the next administration.
Well, there have been no treaties with North Korea. I mean, you cannot really in a straight face look at the situation right now and say the North Koreans continue to violate previous agreements when the Trump administration just ripped up the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear arms deal.
They had every right to do.
Right, let me go back to Dennis to clarify something. Dennis, we saw this very public demolition of this nuclear test site. Are you saying that it can still be used?
Yes, that test site can no longer be used because what they did was blow up those tunnels, those very long tunnels into the ground. So that test site is no longer, it would take perhaps 6 months to a year to build new tunnels to drill it.
Right. In fact, we're looking at pictures right now, exclusive pictures, I understand, of that site being blown up right now. Song, I want to get back to something else. And President Trump has talked about sanctions. He says that he will continue what he called the strongest sanctions in history against the DPRK. But for that, he's going to need China, isn't he?
Yes.
Is China going to go along with that?
I think so. And just as our Foreign Minister Wang Yi was saying yesterday here in Washington, that China has been always in favor of denuclearization in the peninsula. China is always implementing the UN Security Council economic sanctions against DPRK. Until and unless the denuclearization will be done in the peninsula.
Dennis, very quickly, what are the options right now? I mean, how do they get back to talks, saving face?
Well, I think the Chinese could play a very major role right now, putting some pressure on the North Koreans to quiet down, to come to the table ready in a constructed mood, and at the same time advising the Americans on how to deal with the North Koreans. So I see China really at the middle of this particular moment of the crisis. And I hope that the Chinese will put the kind of pressure on the North Koreans that'll get them back to the table and will give the kind of advice to the administration that will get us in the right place.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.